In the many years of making conversion videos, I've covered a lot of Chaos minis. I've kitbashed Chaos Corrupted Space Marines, Guardsmen, Sisters of Battle, Leagues of Votann, and even a few Demon Princes. But one thing I've never done is create my own Chaos God. Now we all know the big four, but there is a lot of room for my own creations among the numerous minor gods of Chaos. So join me as I build my very own god based on the signs of the Zodiac. Now, I'm not someone who is into astrology, but as a source of inspiration, it's a very rich seam to mine. So my aim with this build was to create a god based around the star sign Aquarius, which has traits related to intelligence, creativity, and innovation. Now those traits overlap a little with Tzeentch, which got me thinking, what if each of the 12 astrological signs were simply more focused aspects of each of the 4 Chaos gods? Kind of like a Catan shard, but for Chaos. So with that in mind, I decided to base the appearance of my Aquarius Chaos God, or Andaura, on that of a pink horror-like creature, which led me to using the Slann Starmaster as my basis. One of the first changes was to switch out the small staff of the Slann to a long-handled blade by combining it with the sword taken from the Namarti Thrall kit. After cutting away the Slann's staff head and base, the same was repeated on the sword before cleaning up both of the cuts. Both the new blade and the pommel were attached to the handle to create a slightly more ocean-inspired weapon. At this point, I continue to assemble the torso. One of the more recognisable aspects of the Slann are their big froggy faces, but I didn't want a Slann, so I decided to replace it with something else. After a lot of trial and error with various different head sources, I decided to take a leaf out of Miyazaki's book and just give him a big old disc for a face. This particular piece was sourced from the Talos kit, with the swirling patterns giving the model a little more watery styling. After cutting down and filing smooth the top plate of the Slann's head, I did a quick dry fit against the torso. This revealed that a little more trimming and adjustment was required, and after further trimming, the head and disc were glued to the torso. This left me with a good starting point. But if you're anything like me, when you think of oceans and ancient gods, you think of Cthulhu, and by extension, you think of tentacles. Which brought me neatly to a mention of my dead Anelbit kit. Earlier this year, someone I met at a convention told me that the bull horns in this kit work really well as tentacles, and so I was eager to give it a go myself. And lo and behold, after a little trimming and gluing, they work surprisingly well. I forget exactly who mentioned this to me, but thanks for the tip, and if you have any interesting uses for the parts yourself, then leave me them down below. So after clipping down and placing both sizes of the horns to the model, I created this crown of tentacles that spilled out from behind the disc. These simultaneously help to cement the disc as being the head, and also push that build a little bit further away from the base model. But before we continue with our custom Chaos God, let's first hear from the sponsors of this video, Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. As a regular player of Tacticus myself and owner of a few Diamond Rank champions, I think I'm in a great position to tell you about the fast-paced tactical gameplay that Tacticus has to offer. In Tacticus, you can lead over 80 champions from 18 playable factions across extensive PvE modes like the campaign, or you can take on other players in high-stakes PvP in the tournament arena. You can even team up with some guildmates. Personally, this is my go-to mode, as taking on bosses in guild raids and pushing forward across the shifting battle lines of Guild War is just incredibly fun. But by far my favourite aspect of Tacticus is that the devs are constantly adding fresh content, events, and game modes. And speaking of fresh content, the season of the Chapter Master has just begun, with Monius Calgar taking centre stage in the first ever Legendary Battle Pass. But that's not all. From the 7th of December, Haskiel Thorn of the Silken Blade will be joining the Emperor's Children roster. This melee specialist delights in taunting enemies and dishing out bonus attacks when he's in the thickest of the fighting. And to round out the year, on the 28th of December, Commander Farsight arrives on the battlefield. This champion of the Tau brings his mastery of Muntka to help bolster the offensive output of his Tau teammates when in close range. Officially licensed with an average rating of 4.5 across the app stores, Tacticus is perfect for any Warhammer fan and can be played on both mobile and desktop. Check out the game for yourself by using my QR code on screen now or my link below, and use my code DECHELLOHOHO for some in-game bonuses. You can also pick up some extra Blackstone by using my friend referral code U-61-NAP2. Now, let's get back to that Chaos Guard. So, with Andaurar built, I could work on their throne. Now, I know I said I wanted to distance myself from the original slant kit, but that floating throne is just too cool not to use. It would, however, require a good deal of adjustment first. This involved the removal of most of the obvious lizardmen details that weren't a physical part of the throne, as well as the removal of all the leaves and grasses that gave the model that jungle theme. This was quite an involved process as there were lots of bits to remove, but between my clippers, knife and files, I was able to remove most of the parts, as well as flattening out large parts of the throne's seat. After removing all the superfluous details, I could finally begin assembling the chair, for which I did the unusual thing of actually reading the instructions. When it came to how this throne would be mounted to the base, I did decide to make a few tweaks. Normally, the Slan Starmaster sits on an 80mm round base, but as there are a few units in the Chaos ranges that this model could be run as, I decided to cut down the height, squash it onto a 60mm base, and run it as a Demon Prince. After comparing the vines against the base, I marked out the rough height with a Sharpie, erring on the side of caution and making the remaining sections longer than they would need to be. These vines were then clipped, trimmed and filed, all while making frequent comparisons against that 60mm base. Once I was happy with how they were all lining up, I repeated the same process with the vines that sat towards the front of the throne. At this point, I had my throne, base and frog, which meant that I could begin working on those extra little details. To add a little chaotic flair to the model, I decided to add a few strands of skulls. The skulls came from the Citadel Skulls kit, and I drilled a hole directly through them. A piece of 1mm rod was threaded through these holes to help hold the skulls together and create a small mounting point at the top. With the skull chain complete, I decided to start adding those aspects of Andaurar that related to his followers' thirst for knowledge and technical development. These took the form of scrolls, books, and pieces of parchment, and it would be the latter of these that I decided to attach to the bottom of the skull chains. These strips of parchment were taken from my other kit, Sorcerer's Spoils, and I would be dipping back into that set a few more times before the end of the video. With the skull chains complete, I drilled a few holes into the underside of the throne's horns and glued the protruding piece of plastic rod into each one. To help further separate the god from his slan source, I created some necklaces by cutting down some of the whips from the Witch Elves kit. After a little trimming, they were both glued to the chest. During my reading up about Aquarius, I found that this is technically classed as an air sign rather than a water, or an aqua sign. But I still wanted to incorporate some more liquid-based detail, so I grabbed a few of these vessels and bottles from the Akhelian Alloplex kit and attached them to the throne. As I mentioned earlier, I would now fill in the rest of the throne with more parts from my Sorcerer's Spoils kit. I did a dry fit of the god before clipping away a bunch of the scrolls, parchment pieces and books before temporarily arranging them around the god. Once I picked out a few, these were all glued across the throne, including the space at the top that would normally have had a panel glued over the top of it. I even added a book to the god's open hand. With all the components in place, I just had a few gaps to fill around Andaurar's head, and for this, I decided to use some green stuff. After cutting and mixing up a fresh batch of green stuff, I then grabbed my tools. Using these, I then placed the green stuff into the various gaps between the tentacles, disc and the slan body, before smoothing and blending things out. I didn't have to be particularly neat with this stage, as most of these details would be facing towards the back, but I still took my time to make sure the blends looked natural. While the green stuff cured, I then turned my attention to the base. The throne takes up most of the space here, so I kept things simple by tearing up some cork into roughly shaped rocks. These were superglued to the base, where I made sure to leave plenty of space for the throne and vines. For the final few basing details, I grabbed more skulls as well as a little tentacle pod from the Idoneth range. With that, I could glue my throne and god to a temporary base, and I was ready to make a start on the painting, which I kicked off with a black primer. The god himself would be quite bright, but his throne would be much darker, so black seemed like a good choice of colour for this particular project. I focused initially on getting Andaurar completely painted first before going back to the throne. This did mean that some steps had to be repeated later, but for ease of following this guide, this seemed to make the most sense. Now, as I briefly hinted at earlier, I kind of imagined this god as being a small fragment of Tzeentch, which meant that there would be some overlap in the colour scheme. With the tentacles and body structure, I decided to paint this god up as basically a big old pink horror, and to kick things off, I started out with a base coat of Glistening Gums from the Tooth and Coats range. This was applied through my airbrush for the sake of speed, but you could manually brush this on if you'd prefer. With my base colour achieved, I then started out by adding some highlights. This was achieved by mixing together some Glistening Gums and Elven Skin before spraying this across the model. I focused the application more towards the top facing surfaces and kept those darker spots of Glistening Gums visible in the recesses. From here, I put away the airbrush for a bit and broke out the regular brush. With this, I painted some purple and red glaze into the numerous recesses of the skin. Using a stippling motion and thin layers, I steadily built up the two colours to darken the folds and creases, whilst also adding a more realistic, fleshy colour. With the shading complete, I could now focus on the highlights. For this, I used Elven Skin, and I used this to pick out and emphasise the ridges and creases in the skin with some thin lines of this lighter paint. This was pushed just a little further with an extreme highlight of Ivory Tusk. The principle of these is the same, but you only add small dots to just the sharpest edges and corners of the details. With the skin complete, I next turned my attention towards the gold details, which, for our Andorra, include the faceplate, the jewellery and the banding around the weapon. For all of these, I began with a base coat of Heirloom Gold, which resulted in this nice muted gold colour. To give the gold a corroded and aged look, I took some Akhelian Green contrast paint and heavily diluted it with a little airbrush thinner. This thin mixture was then painted across the gold details where it pooled predominantly into the recesses. For the disc though, I steadily built up the intensity of the colour over several layers and focused these more towards the bottom. After a while, this created a gradient of cleaner gold at the top to the greenish blue at the bottom. Following the washes, I then highlighted all of those metal details using some platinum crown. For the blade, I opted for a bronze effect, and so went with Bitz O Tin for my base coat. I created some weathering with a wash of Verdigris, before adding some highlights with Chaos Bronze. For the claws on the god's hands and feet, I began with the dark grey of Death Reaper, highlighted them with Cold Corpse Blue, and finished off with some small dots of Wolf Grey to the tips. To paint the cover of the book, I chose another Tzeentchian colour and settled on this Abyss Blue for the base coat. This was followed by an initial highlight of Witching Hour Blue, before I painted on some small dots of Leviathan Blue for the extreme highlights. For the pages themselves, I began with some Griffon Claw, before applying another contrast paint. This time I used some Aggaros Dunes, but only after thinning things out a little. This resulted in that slightly yellow, aged parchment effect, which I built upon with some scratchy highlights of Ivory Tusk. Now, for the text on the pages, I cheated and used this 0.05mm fine liner pen. You can use a brush and some black paint for this too, but I found the pen particularly good for when you need to paint a lot of text squiggles. And with that, the god part of this model was complete and I could turn my attention to the throne. But first, I gave everything a coat of Doom Death Black through my airbrush. Now this may seem like I'm just painting some military grey onto my dowdy old nasty ocean grey, but this actually does have a purpose. The black primer has a slightly different finish and colour to the Doom Death Black, which would have meant that, should I make a mistake with my painting later on and want to return to the original black, I couldn't just paint on Doom Death Black, as it would have had a slightly different, but still noticeable, appearance. The easy workaround was just give everything a uniform coat of Doom Death Black. With my surface prepped, again, I started working on those various vines that ran across the surface of the throne. By removing all of, well, most of the leaves, I was left with this kinda gross, fleshy tendrils, which I made even more gross and fleshy by painting them pink using some Royal Cloak. Then highlighting them with some Sword Hilt Burgundy, before adding a few small dots of Glistening Gums. To help boost the saturation of that dark pink, I then applied a slightly thin layer of Sigvald Burgundy as a filter. You want your mix to not darken things down much, you just want to slightly boost the intensity of that pink colour. With the vines complete, I began the slow process of highlighting all of the edges of the throne. Rather than the usual greystone colour, I opted for a much more sinister looking greenish obsidian by picking out all the details with War Master Green. I then continued highlighting with Traitor Green, but with this lighter paint I only focus on the edges that faced upwards. My final highlight of Legion Green was the usual extreme highlight though, and I used it to dot all of those sharp corners. To give the patches of moss that otherworldly feel, I started out with a base coat of Enchantress Purple. I then started picking out the texture, first with Spectral Purple, and then Amulet Purple. Like with the earlier step, I then applied a light filter of Sigvald Burgundy, which helped to better tie it in to the surrounding vines. At this point, I then repeated the earlier steps I'd used to paint Andowra to tackle the same materials on the throne. These included the little lizards, which I painted the same as the god's skin, the gold, books, parchment, and bronze details. For some of the remaining details, such as the leather-wrapped scrolls and remaining book covers, I used some Scorched Earth, before highlighting them with Ancient Forest, and finally, Wasteland Brown. For the skulls, I decided not to go for the usual bone colour as I wanted a little variation against the various pieces of parchment. Instead, I opted for the warm greys of Ashen Grey, followed by Eidolon Grey, and then Rodent Grey. The result was that of some scorched skulls rather than the usual bleached bones. And with that, I could focus on the base. For the rocks, I recreated the same material that the throne was made of and applied some more War Master Green using a dry brush. The dry brushing was continued with some Traitor Green, and then finally Legion Green. To fill in all of the gaps in the base, I then broke out the texture paste and applied a thick layer of Sorcery Ground from AK Interactive. I once again made sure to leave space for the throne and did some dry fits just to double check how things were lining up. After allowing the paste to fully dry, I gave it a wash of thinned Luxion Purple, before dry brushing the outer edge of the texture paste with some Cyber Pink. All that was left to do now was to clean up the rim with a black acrylic marker, remove the paint from the contact points, glue everything together and spray on a coat of matte varnish, which left me with this. And here we have my finished custom Chaos God, inspired by the Aquarius Zodiac sign. My goal with this build was to create something that had that hint of Tzeentch while still being unique, gave a nod towards the Aquarius sign, and still made sense within the Warhammer universe. And I think I've achieved that. I think I maybe could have pushed the build a little further away from the original model, but I quite like how it's almost got a corrupted parody of the Slann. I imagine Andowra whispering to the tech priests of Mars and the free guild tinkerers of the cities of Sigmar, promising to help them in their next breakthrough, whilst also steering them to create something that will ultimately destroy them. A kind of, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should situation. Now, if you enjoyed this guide and would like to see me tackle other custom Chaos Gods, then let me know in the comments below, and it would be pretty fun to take on more Zodiac-inspired gods who are more focused on aspects of the Big Four. You can find all the kits and paints used in this video down in the description below, along with some affiliate links. I've also recently partnered with Taschen Geld Dieb, so if you're in Germany or any other EU country and you're looking for some discounted Warhammer, be sure to check them out and use my code PETESQUAD for an extra 4% off at checkout. You can also pick up my Dead Animal Bits and Sorcerer's Spoils kits over on my web store, thesparepartsemporium.com. Anything you buy from there is packaged up and shipped by me, and all the sales go directly to supporting me and the channel. But before I go, let me say a huge thank you to everyone who continues to help keep the channel going. And if you would like to support me too, you can get early access to ad-free videos, exclusive merchandise, and even your name in the credits. Simply follow my Patreon link below or hit the join button. Just like my top Patreon supporters did, who are Andrew Marston, Banyevrian, Berserker, Dakota Gaburi, Daniel Dowling, Ferdinand Richardson, George Kanzini Roberts, Nightwolf, Little Templar, Maciej Savitsky, Matt's Mini Minute, Sam Sepulveda, Son of Sevatar, Swedsman, Tim, and Zeth27. And my top channel members, who are Alex Verne, Andrew Chell, Bon Johnson, Chris Toomey, Dante, Dave, Doug H, Guy Bizant, John Gibbs, Kaiser Waffle 11, Mark Taylor, Misa Pogon, Nerdington Paints, Patrick K, Philip Poyer, Rhino Shaughnessy, SO, SJ Carper, Stobox, The Sire Acquired, and Whale Tussler. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.